Hello everyone, welcome today to Blood, Guts, Gore. My name is Eric Barnes. I'm a props master here in St. Louis, Missouri. And today we're going to be talking about different blood and blood effects for shows. It's one of the sort of more fun things I think to do in the props world. This class is sort of broken out into two different phases. The first phase today we're going to be talking about different ways of making blood, different recipes and sort of the reasons why they work and the differences that they have. And the second phase of today's class we'll be talking about different materials that you can use to make either body parts or organs or that kind of stuff. And there's a website built up for this class here on the screen. And that website will have the recipes we're going to be talking about when it comes to blood effects, as well as some other resources available to you as you go about making things for your different shows or for your schools. For the purpose of this class, we're going to be talking simply about things that you can make at home or at your school. I'm going to share 4 recipes with you guys today of bloods that I use fairly often in my prop making needs. The criteria that I have for these recipes is that they have to be as allergy free as possible. I am somebody that's very conscious of the allergens that I put into blood because I know that no matter the best laid plans, that blood is going to get everywhere. It's going to be backstage, it's going to be on things, everyone's going to come in contact with it. I also want to make sure that it's as easily storable as possible. There are some blood recipes that are sort of hard to manipulate and hard to store, and so these are all fairly shelf stable for the purposes of your run. Fake blood tends to fall into 2 major categories. For simplicity in this class, I'm going to refer to them as edible and inedible. That doesn't mean that either of these are supposed to be consumed in large quantities, but what it means is edible ones are safe for the use on the face or in the mouth. And the basic difference between them is simply whether or not they have soap or detergent in them. You have to be very careful with soap-based bloods because you don't want them to get into any of the eyes or mouth for safety and just comfort of the actor. The downside, of course, with edible bloods is since they don't have any kind of detergent in them, they do often stain, or they can often stain depending on what costumes you're using or fabrics you're using. Fake blood tends to fall into a fairly simple general recipe, and that is base, which is often some form of sugar. You're trying to find a base that has a viscosity thicker than water. So that is just to help you start at a place where you have sort of the viscosity of blood, and sort of also the thickness will help you have both pooling effects and droplet effects to make it look more realistic. But those tend to be some version of clear since they are sugar suspended in water. You have to add color, and that's almost always done as a food dye. There's a couple of reasons for this. The simplest is just that they are the most cost effective and available in large quantities, and they do sort of suspend evenly in almost all water-based items. This is one of those cases where you don't want to go out and buy Whole Foods organic made from beets vegetable dye. All of these recipes today are based off of the McCormick food colorings. That will give you the best result in these applications. And then the final thing is an additive, something that will make the clear liquid, now dyed, more cleanable or a little more opaque. I don't know how much experience you guys have with actual blood, but real blood is not clear. It sort of has an opacity to it. And so often when I'm making fake blood, I'll use either cornstarch or cocoa powder to give it a slight opacity. And then the other thing that I'll often add to blood recipes, and this is what makes them inedible, is the idea of detergent or soaps. And they are added sometimes to help thin it out, but most of the time to help keep things clean. So obviously if I'm doing a show that needs a bunch of blood, that blood's gonna have to get washed off of whatever it is for the next show. And by putting detergent in there, you've kind of pre-soaked the item so that it helps to release. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's always gonna work. I've done plenty of shows where with whatever the fabric was, even the soap recipes don't come out of the costumes because of the food dye. So you do always want to test your blood on a sample of whatever the costume is beforehand to make sure that it can wash out if that's important to you. So the first edible blood recipe we're going to be talking about today is one that comes to us from Epicurious, and it is sort of my go-to edible blood. It works in a whole range of different purposes and needs. And it's very simple. It's basically just corn syrup, water, a little bit of cornstarch, and then dyes. And so the ingredients for it are 3/4 of a cup of corn syrup, 1/4 of a cup of water, 1/2 teaspoon of red food coloring, 5 drops of blue food coloring, 2 drops of green food coloring, and a tablespoon of cornstarch. I found it easiest to mix the water and the corn syrup together first, and then to mix in all the food colorings to get to a color that I'm really happy with. and then after that's evenly incorporated, to whisk in the cornstarch. And this is one where you're going to want to let it set for a little bit, because that will help the cornstarch suspend through the liquid. So this Epicurus blood is great for puddles and droplets. It works really well for oozing out of wounds or mouths and things. It is not the greatest at smearing. The surface tension of that cornstarch wants to pull the fake blood into droplets, and so it doesn't tend to make big smears of things. It kind of gets back into some sort of puddle. And also, when it is spread out, because the cornstarch in there, it has a tendency to look a little chalky. The other edible blood that I make a lot is called powdered sugar blood. And it is really great for things like bottles or bags. It has the most realistic look. It looks really good either like in vials or in fake syringes because it does have that sort of flow of real blood. It's a little bit thinner than most other bloods, so it's also really good if you need to do like something that sprays. It's not the best at things like blood trails or spatters, but it does make a really great smear because of that. Because of that thinness, it smears really well. Its ingredients are 16 ounces of powdered sugar, 1 ounce of red food coloring, 1 tablespoon of cocoa powder, and 8 ounces of water. And its preparation is a little different than the other blood recipes we'll talk about. And that's because it's easiest to make this one in a blender. Simply all I do is I'll mix the water and the powdered sugar in a blender. And then once it's become sort of one even liquid, I'll add the food colorings and blend again to make sure that all of that's incorporated evenly. And then finally I'll blend in some cocoa powder. It's also a really great fake blood because it's not nearly as sticky. It tends to not dry out in the hard shell that some of the corn syrup bloods have. Now moving on to the inedible bloods. So these are both bloods that have soap in them. And in fact, the first one we're going to start with has soap as its base. And so one of my favorite tricks I'm trying to do really inexpensive, fast, cheap blood, especially if it's just blood that'll be sitting in a vial or a container on stage or in a cabinet or whatever it is to go to some dollar store and buy their really cheap blue dish soap. This is one of those cases where you don't want to buy the nice stuff. You want to buy the cheapest, basically the most watered down version you can find. And then by adding a little bit of red food dye and a little bit of green food dye, I'm left with a fairly convincing fake blood, especially for being in containers. And so again, the ingredients for that are 1 cup of blue dish soap, 1/4 of an ounce of red food dye, and then a few drops of green. And the drops of green will depend based on what your blue base is, so it's kind of hard to tell you exactly how many that will be. Basically, it just allows you to darken up that blood. And so you can see in these two samples, the first one, the sort of slightly more orangey color, is just the blue dish soap with the red food dye in it. And then by adding a little bit of green, the second one there, you can see the darker color that's produced. Because its base is straight soap, it's not the greatest to use either on the body or coming out of some sort of blood dispenser for a show, because it does have a tendency to kind of suds up. But it does smear relatively well, and because the base is the soap, it will clean up fairly easily. The other big downside of these, because we are buying inexpensive soaps, they do tend to mostly have a fragrance included in them, so if the actors are sensitive to fragrance, that can be a problem. It is hard to find non-scented, cheap dish soaps. And the final recipe I'm going to share with you today is the one that I use for most big productions. I call it production blood. And you can see there's actually 2 versions of this recipe. There's what I use when I'm making a full batch, which is 2.5 gallons. And I've given you a 1/16 version of that. That might be more applicable to your school needs. And this recipe was sort of perfected on a show where we had to make blood by the gallons, and so that's why its base is so big. But the big advantage of this one is that it also allows you, starting with this, what I'm calling thick base blood, to thin it out to different versions just by the addition of water. So you can mix up a single batch of blood and then thin it out if you need to have things like, different dispensers to do wounds on a body, or, somebody leans against a wall and bleeds down that wall. You can thin it out and put it into a ketchup bottle hidden behind the wall. And it gives you a lot of variety by just adding water to it. And so for the 1/16 version, the ingredients are 2 cups of Caro syrup, which is corn syrup, 2 tablespoons of red food dye, a teaspoon and a couple drops of green food dye, 3/4 of a teaspoon of yellow food dye, and a tablespoon of Dreft, which is a baby laundry detergent. You can use any clear, allergy-free, hypoallergenic detergent that you want. This, as sort of opposed to our last thing we just talked about, is where you don't want to have any colorant in the laundry detergent because that will change your color ratio. And again, I've given you sort of my most used, sort of where I start the color process for all of these dyes. That's not to say that you can't change things up depending on what you like, what you're looking for. Obviously, blood as it dries out gets a little darker. Fresh blood, depending on who it is, tends to be a little orangey or more cherry red. So there are a whole different spectrum of colors that you can achieve by just changing the dye in each of these different batches. So life casting is the use of a molding material that is able to be skin safe. The most common one that's used for life casting is what's called alginate. I don't know if you guys have ever had braces or other orthodontic work, but that stuff that they use to take an impression of your mouth, that's called dental alginate. And what that's made out of is basically ground up seaweed, and that then when it's hydrated in water, creates sort of like stiff pudding consistency that you're able to take a fast impression of. There are a couple of downsides though. One of the downsides is that the molds don't last super long because they are water-based, and so what happens is that water starts leaching out of the mold. Within the matter of 24 hours, the mold has already shrunk. This is a hand that we made for Evil Dead when we did it at Parkway South High. And you can see this was cast off of the actual actor's hand. We made a big block of alginate that he put his hand in, and then he had to leave it there until we get an impression of it. We use this product from Smooth On. It's called AlgaSafe Breeze. It's this blue goo that hydrates in water, and it's really cool to work with. Now the thing to know about this is that the temperature of the water is very important when you're working with it. You don't want to have super hot water, but you do want to have slightly warm water. Basically, if you put your finger into it, it should feel slightly warm, because the hotter the water, the faster it's going to set up on you. And setting up on a thumb is one thing, but you can imagine if you're trying to do a full hand or other body part that's larger, you don't want that to happen too fast, and then you kind of ruin the mold. So I'm just making sure that this is all evenly incorporated. I've already sort of portioned this out into 2 ounces, because what you do is you mix 1 ounce of this product into 5 ounces of water, or in this case I've got 2 ounces here into 10 ounces of warm water. I'm going to then put that into our water here, scraping out the container. And you can see it kind of sinks to the bottom. What you're then going to want to do is make sure that you mix it up really well. You can see how it's kind of starting to become like little threads or strands. Eventually, as I keep stirring this fairly vigorously, it will kind of start homogenizing. And as I go, it'll start sort of getting lighter in color too. You guys can already see in that time we've been working how it's kind of gotten thinner. The little strands have kind of broken up into almost like little beads, it looks like now. Now's when you kind of want to really make sure you're whipping it. And then you kind of want to make sure that you're getting all of the edges really well scraped down. You don't have a bunch of glops sort of hanging on the sides or at the bottom. And then as I kind of stir this and as it kind of goes, see how it's kind of lightening in color as we go? Right? It will keep going a little bit lighter and a little bit lighter. If I was doing this for myself, or if I was doing this with somebody else, I would then pour this into a small cup and have them invert their thumb straight into it. But in the case of this, what I'm doing is I'm going to just pour this slowly over our thumb to make an impression. And then just sort of tap it down if there's any air bubbles. Again, if I was doing this personally, or if I was having a student do this, what I would do instead is I would pour our materials into a cup like this, and then have them invert their finger straight into that cup. And the same result would happen. This is just saving me having to put my thumb in and using that plastic thumb as an example. And in about 15 minutes, that will harden up to be fairly solid. Now, as I said, this is an alginate product, so that means that I then have to sort of work kind of fast to make a safer copy of it. So what I use a lot is I use a product called Monster Clay. It is available as these big bricks, and then I melt it down in one of those silicone square ice cube containers to make it a little more manageable. This is really easy to work with. You can microwave in the microwave, or you can use a double boiler to get it sort of back to liquid consistency. And then I'm able to pour in that liquid clay and sort of get a perfect copy of my whatever I'm casting, whether it's a finger or a hand, as a stable version. This is in fact that exact same finger that I cast earlier, just to kind of give you a sense. This is the model clay version of it, right? So now this, even though my mold won't last for more than about 24 hours, this is now stable for me to keep and work on in the future. If I were to also want to, let's say, sculpt into it, so I use this trick a lot if I'm doing things like wounds or bullet holes onto something. Obviously, I'm not going to want to sculpt that onto the human's face and then mold that. What I'll do is I'll make a full wax copy of their face and then sculpt into that whatever treatment I'm trying to work on. It allows me to sort of have a long open working time to get all the details that I want to as I'm working on something. The other thing too, I don't tend to use it a lot, but I do know places that use plaster a lot to cast into their fingers. I know some places you've even had like, sometimes they have them at like amusement parks and festivals and stuff where you can make like a copy of your hand. This is sort of that same idea. I just like the monster clay because it allows me both a really great detail capture. It picks up really, really well, but also it's really easy to manipulate. So if I were to want to go in and sculpt something, or instead of having a thing wanting to carve into this or make it look differently, I was able to do that straight from this positive. So this class talking about obviously body parts and gore things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that always that's what I use it for. I use it also a lot for fake foods. So in the same way that you just saw me use alginate to make a mold of the finger, what I've done in the past is made an alginate mold of a chicken breast, and then I poured in the same way a wax copy of that, and I was able to make a silicone mold that will last a lot longer. And then into that mold I can cast using dragon skin, either a realistic chicken breast, or one of the classes I taught wanted to make a fun gold chicken breast. These are the same products, just tinted differently. It's called dragon skin. It's a sort of semi-clear platinum pure silicone that has the density of human skin, they say. And so it allows that sort of really realistic flesh feel. It's the same thing that the hand is also molded out of. And again, by going from a wax positive into a silicone mold, the silicone mold I made almost a decade ago, and it still will cast just perfectly fine. As we've been chatting, our alginate has set up. You can see now that this is basically solid. It's still a little spongy. It sort of feels like very, very dense jello or very, very dense pudding, but it has started setting up. So we can demold that in just a second. Now this is all talking about making your own custom molds. Obviously if you're doing things like hands or feet or things that are supposed to match a person, I did a show once where we had to have 4 copies of each actor. One copy of each 4 actors in dead body form. And so we had to make obviously their faces for each of those body forms. We had to custom mold them, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to. I also have used a lot, this is just one of those Halloween jello molds, in this case for a heart. And what you can then do with that is you can cast it in one of 2 ways. I've already showed you the dragon skin, which is sort of the long-lasting version, right? It will always look as it is. This is sort of a heart that I made when we did Frankenstein, cast out of layers of dragon skin and then coated with different versions to kind of give it that gooey look, right? And then we cover this in blood for the show. This is basically just 2 versions of this heart, which you can kind of see is halfway through, glued together to give us that 3-dimensional version. The other thing that I'll use if I don't have the budget for dragon skin, because it is kind of expensive, although it lasts for forever, is use a really cheap version called ballistics gel. It's one of my favorite things to work with because it's really inexpensive. And basically all that ballistics gel is it's super, super stiff gelatin, right? So what I do, the recipe that I like the best, is I use this instant gelatin. Doesn't really matter the brand, but the super fine powdered stuff that you can find at grocery stores and stuff. What I will say is if you are going to try this, do not buy it at like a normal supermarket. Make sure you go to Sam's Club or Costco or something place that has the whole, like the big warehouse sizes or, you know, food restaurant size gelatin, because you're going to need 1 ounce of gelatin per every 8 ounces of water, or about 3 tablespoons, slightly more than 3 tablespoons of gelatin per 8 ounces of water. And what you'll do is you'll sprinkle that gelatin into the water and let it sort of sit in there for about an hour. You'll see it kind of clumps together and sort of becomes like a big sort of gooey, it looks kind of like a super ball almost. And then slowly over a double boiler, to make sure that you don't burn it or to scorch it, you'll then melt that back down until it becomes a clear liquid. And then you can cast all sorts of things out of it. This is that same heart mold cast in our ballistics gel. And in this case, all I did was use a little bit of food dye, so it kind of has a sort of clear, glossy quality. If I wanted to make it look a little more realistic, I could do it in stages. I could either brush in some in different colors to kind of give it a variety, or I could mix in a little bit of cornstarch or a little bit of opaque white pigment to use to give it a little more realistic look. But considering these are made out of, you know, very different materials, but they have sort of the same look once you get onto stage. It's also really good for casting things like our finger. So this is that same finger mold, but just casting clear. So this is the color it will be once it comes straight out of the mold. And then you can tint it in any number of colors just using food dye and stuff. And the thing that's really great about it is that it really does capture a really great surface texture. Now, the one thing you are going to be aware of is that it does, because it is water-based, will start shrinking on you. So it's not something that's going to last in the fridge for a huge amount of time. I tend to say that you want to use it within about 48 hours. So if you've made it for, let's say, a show that has a Thursday, Friday, and Saturday show, probably be okay, but you wouldn't want to use it for the next week. What does happen, especially smaller, thinner versions, is it does kind of start shrinking, just that water evaporates out. Bigger things like the heart or stuff like that don't tend to shrink nearly as much, obviously, because they have a bigger volume to start with. If you are doing delicate things like, you know, coins or little organs or things like that, they will start slightly to shrink. Now, obviously, there is a third version of this, which is you don't have to use any kind of mold other than, I have in the past just used like aluminum foil, right? So if I'm just trying to make like weird, you know, random organs in a jar, or random things where I'm not totally trying to make a realistic thing, you can just form either wax paper or aluminum foil into a shape that you like, and then same thing, pour this ballistics gel into that, and it will give you a great sort of copy without having to go to the work of finding something itself. This is also really great too if you're just going to have like generic innards or organs. You can kind of just make big logs and pour the ballistics gel in and have sort of that, you know, internal organ randomness, and it works really well for that. So as we've been talking through this, this is now ready to come out of the mold. Obviously, if I had my finger in, I could pull straight out, but since this is in a cup, in this case I'm going to cut open the cup just to get it out a little bit faster. And then just by sort of wiggling around, you're able to sort of slightly loosen up our figure. And then pull out our finger. And in there you can see this has now that void that will allow us to create copies of whatever we're looking for. So, as I said, this will last us about 24 hours. I will try and take some photographs as it sort of starts drying out to sort of add in and show you what it looks like as it sort of dries out and starts condensing. But as I said, if I wanted to keep this mold, if I wanted to work on this mold more, this positive, I can then cast either in wax or in plastic into that, and then have a positive that I can then work on making a silicone mold out of. And then that silicone will be able to last for forever. One of the other things that I really like about dragon skin is that it allows me to also create sort of generic gooey things, right? So We've seen it so far as the hand and then as the chicken breast and the heart, but the other thing that's available to it is by using it in thin sheets, I can also make like gooey messes with it. So that's sort of like using some flesh-colored pigment and some red pigment, making sort of like a random biospill thing. I use it a lot if I'm doing like messy desks and stuff and I want to make like an ink splot. Because again, I can have it and it has all that wet look of ink. I can even embed things like pens or things into this. And then whenever that scene change needs to happen, I can just peel it off of that surface. And the same is true of like messes, especially like, you know, things like that. It allows you to embed things into it, and so it can have a lot of texture very easily and give you that kind of disconcerting look because of, you know, the sort of sheen that it has. The smooth on product called Dragon Skin. This version is Dragon Skin 10. They have a bunch of different versions. The basic difference between them is just how dense they are. So they use what's called the durometer. Durometer is just how dense it is when you squeeze it. 10 is the one that I find works the most efficiently. They have different denser ones or not as dense ones for different prosthetics and stuff. And then to dye it or to tint it, you're going to want to use a product called Silpig, which is just the silicone pigment for it. This is just a mold of a coaster basically that I have, but this gives you a sense of what dragon skin looks like without any pigment or toning in it itself. It's just sort of like a slightly translucent, roughly clearish color, just to kind of give you a sense of what that looks like. And it's really nice because it's really super stretchy, so it works really well for these things. So that is life casting, especially with alginates. As I said, it's a really great sort of starter way of getting into molding and casting and stuff because it is so efficient both in how fast the stuff sets up and also how inexpensive relatively it is. And also that, you know, if something goes wrong with your mold because you're not planning on using it for forever, it's not sort of the heartbreak that, you know, messing up a silicone mold can be on your first couple of attempts to try things. And there is one last product that doesn't really fit neatly into any category, but it is one that I use a lot. It's a product called Rubber Glass. It's really great at being used for all sorts of special effects. So it's this super thin, super translucent, you know, water clear product. But the nice thing about it is that it flakes like actual glass. So as you break it, it kind of shards like a normal glass would. So it's really good for a couple of different things. It's really good for both sort of adding out if you have somebody that's supposed to be walking on broken glass, or just to add, you know, detail onto your set or something if there's supposed to be a broken window. But the other thing that it's really great for is embedding into wounds and things. So you can see like this piece here, if I were to sculpt a wound and sort of embed that in with with skin-safe silicones, it would make a really cool like cut look. And it's just kind of really fun to play with and shatter. Because as I said, it does sort of break up like little clumps of glass. And it has that sort of reflectivity that's really cool. Thank you so much for coming today to Blood, Guts, and Gore. I hope you guys enjoyed that class and you can think of some fun and gory things to make for your productions at school. There's a website for the class here on the screen, and that will give you a copy of all the blood recipes we talked about, as well as the references to all of the products we talked about and where to find them. And I hope you guys have created some good ideas and some new ideas to create gooey and gory things for your shows at school. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your conference, and I will see you around. Have a great day. Bye.